Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Scott. Welcome to our podcast today. I have Justine and Kaitlyn here with me, and they'll say hi in just a second. To get things started, let's go ahead and check in. Um, we're going to check in either something that's going on, positive, significant in your life, spiritually, physically, intellectually, emotionally, or socially. I'll go ahead and start, and I'm going to pick two. And by the way, I'll just say that we're recording this just prior to Christmas. So when you all see and hear it, it'll be New Year's. But so things might not match up time-wise with what we share. Physically, I had a good doctor's appointment yesterday and progressing well with the foot, and things are going better there. I had foot surgery. And emotionally, Nanette and I had a really good conversation this morning. And sometimes we're just so busy with life that that doesn't always happen. So I really cherish just having a good conversation with her. So that's what's going on with me. Kate, you want to start? Kaitlyn?
Yeah. Hi guys. Yeah, I would say, maybe emotionally, there's just been a lot of things that have been going on in like my private life that I've been able to navigate really well. And it's just been, maybe things like that I didn't necessarily want, but it's like the way that I've been able to navigate them and the way that I've been able to respond. I think I've been really proud of myself and just kind of knowing that I'm staying on the right track with that. So
Nice. Justine?
Yeah, I think mine is probably the same as last time, only because it's still around Christmas that just a lot of time with family and friends and getting to rest and recharge from work is always really nice. So
Yeah, especially if you're in education. I'm glad that you're getting that time to recharge.
yes, yeah.
All right, we're going to jump right in. So we have a topic or a question each time. So the question today is, what is the best starting point for teaching the Christian faith? I will say that you can talk about this just generally in spirituality or religion. I'm talking about it in terms of the Christian faith in particular, but you can kind of take it either direction. So the question is, what is the best starting point for teaching the Christian faith? I'm going to kind of say where I'm coming from with this, but before I do you either one of you have just like a gut reaction or a knee-jerk response to that in terms like what's first thing on your mind? It's okay if you don't.
no.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Um, all right, here we go. So I think when it comes to the Christian faith, I know this sounds a little bit obvious and maybe like a duh moment to say this, but I think it's important that you start with Jesus and not necessarily a certain doctrine about a certain doctrine about something else or an ology, like if you will, or an ism, like some kind of belief, or even the Bible necessarily, or what we believe about the Bible. So I think the fundamental question to start with is, who is Jesus to you? So that's the claim I'm making, that I'm throwing out there. Who is Jesus to you? I have a couple of reasons for saying this. One of them is from the Bible. And so I would go to Matthew in the New Testament, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16. There's this account of something that happens where it's a story that's told that Jesus takes his disciples to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And so that's kind of north of where they usually are. They go up there to this place, and there's this huge rock there. And this place is known for worship of all kinds of gods, emperor worship, Greek worship, just different gods, different cults, kind of belief systems are there and prevalent. And the way it's laid out, there's caves and things. And so some believe that there was like an entrance to the underworld or Hades. And so this is the place where you might have heard this teaching where Jesus says to them, "Who do people say I am?" And then they kind of give these answers. Well, some say you're Elijah, some say this and that. And then he says, "Well, but who do you say I am?" And that's where Peter, one of the disciples, says, "You are the Christ. You're the Son of the living God." And then Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of, technically, the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So I think the context for that, there's a big debate in church history between Catholics and Protestants about what that means and stuff. I think we're kind of all wrong about it, but I think it's really talking about that rock right there. And he's saying nothing can prevail against this truth of me being the Christ. And the reason I think that's the fundamental starting point is because he's asking people, who do you say I am? Who am I to you? And then once you establish that, then we'll talk about building the church. And of course, he's the one who builds the church. We don't build it. So it's first Jesus and his identity, and then talk about everything related to what church means and what that community of faith is. And he's not talking about a church building when he's talking about that. So that's one reason, that's one claim for why I say that. I think it's important to start there because I think that's where Jesus started, and it makes sense the way the story is told. I think another reason, just again biblically, is if you go through the New Testament, it's kind of insane how all the letters, they start with, like, so if you read one of the letters in the New Testament, the first chapter of each letter will first talk about Jesus and only Jesus. Like, Jesus Christ is this and that, and just goes on and on about Jesus. And then it gets into the topics. Like, okay, now let's talk about this other stuff. So I think that's a good example and a good model for us. And then the final thing I'm going to say right now is I think Christianity is a relationship, not a religion, in the sense that it's really understanding how God is relating to us and how we're relating to God. And Jesus is the one who makes that visible for us. Jesus is the one who makes that tangible for us. And so I think who is Jesus to you is really the critical point because it honors the fact that it's a relationship and it's two parties involved. And my answer to who is Jesus might change over time for healthy reasons, unhealthy reasons, good reasons, bad reasons. Maybe it's a level of maturity. Maybe it's insight, revelation, all kinds of reasons. But I I think those are critical reasons why that's the best starting point. And I'll be quiet for a minute, see what you all have to say about that. And then I have some ideas of like bad starting points that we use instead of that. And so maybe we'll unpack that a little bit. Any thoughts? Any response so far?
Justine, if you want to go first, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, to everything you were just saying, I definitely agree with that, that's a good starting point. I think there is also something to be said for not that I, necessarily agree or disagree with raising children up in the church. Um, I will say though, I think there is a lot to be said for being at the point or the age or maturity or however you want to describe it to where you can answer that question for yourself. Who is Jesus to you? Because I do think, a lot of times, and as a kid who was raised in the church, and I do think that, that did benefit me in a lot of ways. And some of my morals and values do still come from the faith, but I do also think that I wanna kinda be careful how I say this, but, like, that I have also seen people who join the church later on in life when they could better answer that question for themselves versus, maybe it was just something that was ingrained in them or something their parents told them, and their faith as a result of that looked different than mine or was just more theirs, I guess. So, those were kinda some of the thoughts that were running through my head as you were talking about all that, but I do agree with that is a really important, if not the most important question to kind of ask.
Kaitlyn, did you have anything you
Oh,
wanted to say?
I mean, I agree with what Justine is saying, and I kind of pretty much have like that same, um, like just like viewpoint of it. But I agree ultimately that yeah, I think that is the best way to start that conversation because I think that people tend to lose track of what is most important when it comes to Christianity, when they get into all the religious talk or, you know, possibly politics, you know, like it could just it goes far off very quickly and very fast. And I think people tend to also lead with emotions more so when there's not like a simple question like that, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm taking notes here at the same time so that I want to circle back to a couple of things. But since you just mentioned that right there, I'll go ahead and say I think where a lot of this starts usually, this journey is first of all, people talking about their church, like as far as programming, music ministry, preaching styles. A lot of it has to do with personality, charisma, which none of those things in and of themselves are bad or wrong. It's just not the starting point of the Christian faith. Like, and I think that would be true if you talked about another religious belief system. But that's a lot of what we talk about. And I think almost as someone who was in leadership at a church, I think I sometimes, I would never say this, but inadvertently, like almost subconsciously, I think we almost train people to start there. Like, well, invite people to this program, tell people how good this teaching is, or we're going to offer this class or do this preaching series. And again, none of those things are wrong in and of themselves, but if you ask the typical church member to say anything about Jesus, like just talk about the depths of your relationship with Jesus or what you think about God right now, I think people struggle with that. Like it's awkward for them because that's not what we're doing. Like, so that's one. Another common one is most questions revolve around what do you believe about? What do you believe about this or that? And it could be a theological issue, it could be a political issue. And that I think is a poor starting point because it leads to division almost immediately with most things. But it doesn't allow for the fact that like the three of us could answer the question, who is Jesus to us, very differently. We could also answer it almost like identically. Like we could all say, right now in this phase of our life, we all believe this about Jesus, but we could hold vastly different views on immigration. And we could hold vastly different views on women in leadership in the church or anything like that. Like the what do you believe about topics. And so I think starting with Jesus is important for those reasons. Um, I even think the question, which is a very genuine, authentic question, is like how am I saved? How do I join this church? Whatever. I even think that's the wrong starting point, really, because it's kind of almost treating church like a club membership in a way. Like, how do I get my admission ticket to this place? Um, so I want to pause there again, see your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I was actually gonna say like just kind of what you just said, the club membership, kind of it, like that's how it feels or whatever. I feel like I have a good example of that, or like a way in which I felt like that's what the church was giving when I was involved in a church, you know, years ago. Was we were a part of this like um you know, club with the church. And it was like a bunch of young kids, right? Like going out and preaching about God and trying to save all these kids that were in these low income households or in apartments. And it always kind of felt wrong to me because we would go there for like a week, right? We'd see these kids every day at like different sites. And the goal was to convert them to Christianity. It wasn't to actually like get to know them, understand them, um, you know, kind of just like see them as human beings almost. It was, and then when we would go back to the church, that's what they were concerned about. They literally had a board that was like, look at all these kids we've saved. And it was like a big number. And it's just kind of like, but did you really pour into these people's lives? Or did you kind of just go there and, in a sense, like exploit them, sort of, just to get them to convert to Christianity? Like, it's just because it's like, you're never going to see those kids again. You're not going to go back there after this week. You're not going to check up on them. And so that just felt very inauthentic to me. And it just felt like, yeah, like that was their goal, was just that, was just how can we quickly convert people without really having like a genuine relationship and connection to them. And yeah, like that's kind of how a lot of, at least in my opinion, big churches work. They care more about, you know, the surface level things within the church, or yeah, like how they look as a church. And it kind of just takes away from like the bigger picture and like what's actually important, I feel. So yeah.
Justine, anything on that?
I don't think so. I definitely completely agree. And I think, me and Kaitlyn growing up in the same church, and so obviously I know exactly what she's talking about. And I was also a part of that, um, those programs and those things that we did. And that might be even a completely different conversation just about the emphasis that the church puts on, and I'm gonna butcher the word because I say it wrong every time, but evangel or however you say that word, but
Like
evangelize.
evangelizing? Yeah.
Yes, evangelizing, the emphasis that's put on that, and exactly what Kaitlyn was saying, instead of let's get to know these people, there are needs besides just spiritual needs that may need to be met here, but for some reason it does seem like oftentimes the church is mostly just focused on that spiritual aspect of it. Um, so yeah, but I feel like that might be a different discussion because that's like a whole other, but
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's the spiritual aspect as much as the transactional aspect. Like I would say that's almost like get this transaction done, and like then we get credit in the bank kind of thing, and then we can go back and like the board you said that they had up and stuff. I was part of a church where we had annual like regional meetings. They called them district assemblies, but and we came together and all the pastors had to report out on statistics like related to those kinds of things. And um, one of the things that's important to me as we have these conversations, well, two things that I'm thinking of is one is the generational piece to this. Um, like this might be a conversation where it's not really about generational. Like the way we're talking is like my generation kind of did the same thing that you're describing. Your generation in church did the same thing. Um, but sometimes there might be a generational aspect to this where you're just going to say, well, the people I hang around with now, we don't see it that way. It's different, and for that reason. The other thing is it's important to me. I am critical of systems and processes that are in place that are kind of just have us going through motions until we question them. But individuals within the system, I genuinely believe there are a lot of people acting with pure motives and good intentions with a lot of this. So, like, even the thing about, well, we went back and everything was about how many people we converted or saved or how many people did this or that. I think that's because people genuinely believe, like, that's the work of the kingdom, like, that's the work of God or something, which I would argue is part of the fundamental problem from underlying all of this. And so that part about motive, I think, is something for us to kind of keep in mind as we're having these conversations. It's very interesting to me. Also, since I don't see anybody jumping to say, yes, Marc, that is absolutely right. I will. My other thing that I wanted to circle back to, and this will be other conversations that we get into, and kind of the point of this, because people who are listening that are like your age, wondering about the church they are connecting to or disconnecting from. I went through a kind of a weird journey of raising children while deconstructing. And so there might be people like that. But to circle back kind of to Justine's comment near the beginning, and we don't need to have a full-on conversation about this right now, but do you have any initial thoughts as far as if we pose the question, who is Jesus to you? When is someone quote unquote too young to really be able to articulate an answer to that question? Are there any initial thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I don't know if there's like a too young. um, I think for me, eh, I think for me, because you know, technically speaking, accepted Christ when I was 4 years old, and just looking back on that, and again, you're right, this is a whole other conversation, so I don't wanna get, like, too much into it, but I just think that that is such a common thing when kids are so young, and whether it's out of, "This is what my family's doing, this is what they believe," maybe, a little bit of fear about what comes after this life and just what we're taught about that, and just fearing, yeah, I don't want to be separated from my family when I, leave this earth, or I don't want to be in a place like that they're describing, when I eventually die, like that. Um, I don't know. So I think for me, I don't know that I have a specific age in mind when I'm talking about that, but I think that I don't think that I fully understood, and, I've since stepped away from the church and deconstructed, but I would say that I didn't fully understand what, accepting Christ and Christianity and all that entailed until maybe I was more in middle school, I would say, and I could kind of, and then I would argue that I didn't really even start, teasing apart who was Jesus to me until I got to college, hence the deconstruction. So, it's kind of like I think it's so different for everyone. I don't know that there's, like, an age, but yeah, I don't know.
I think next time we talk, um, the question that we'll deal with may be able to get us into a little bit more of that story because I'm really curious about the whole when I got into middle school, I felt this way or thought this way. When I got to college, that's when I began to deconstruct. I'm curious as to the why and what that looked like a little bit. So I really hope that our next conversation, all three of us are together, but we'll figure that out later. Um, Kaitlyn, did you have something you wanted to add? I couldn't tell if you were unmuting or not.
Um, yeah, I mean, I was just going to kind of piggyback off of what Justine was saying. I think when it comes to children and young minds, I think the biggest thing that is problematic when it comes to beliefs and, raising children to believe a certain way is that children, young children, are never going to be thinking for themselves, if that makes sense. Like children are very vulnerable, they're very impressionable. So they are quite literally more easier to, convince, possibly manipulate. And so I think, it's not necessarily about like which age is appropriate. I think that's more of a question of like, children should be able to, children are naturally curious, right? So it's okay to talk with children when they are asking you questions where they are genuinely curious versus it's being shoved on them or being something that they're supposed to believe in, if that makes sense. So I feel like it's more of like making sure that like as parents or whoever, right, that that's never something that should be, I guess, like, mm, hold on. I'm like, wait, how do I say this? Like basically like just with young children and when it comes to beliefs, I think that should be something that naturally happens. I don't think that should ever be something that's like you have to believe this way or almost like grooming a child to believe a certain way. I think that if that is something that they really want, it's eventually going to happen. And like they'll see it with like, right, like if their parents are super religious or they have these beliefs or whatever, like they're naturally going to become more and more curious. But as adults and parents, I would disagree that it's like their job, right, to make sure their child is converted to their belief. I think that will naturally happen, or it won't happen. And I think that that's okay. And we should always also be respectful of like giving your child free will too, because that is in the Bible and that is what God says. So I look at it like that, I guess.
That's very interesting. As someone, I can tell you that as a parent, if you are ingrained in those evangelical ideas, you do think it's your job. You do think it's your responsibility, and it's like your top responsibility is your child's soul is on the line. Like and so that again, it goes back to motive. That's why I think there's a lot of people in churches that are parents that really love and care for their kids, and in so doing can do some harmful things because they think that's their top priority. I got to get this kid to heaven. Like, and again, I think that's probably because we're just not spending enough time answering the question, who is Jesus to you, really? Because that reveals a lot of what we think about Jesus. If our number one goal is to make sure our kid avoids eternal damnation, or a terrible eternity. And I think
I mean,
the afterlife piece, I think, is an important part of that. Go ahead.
well, sorry, no, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, I mean, it does kind of reveal a lot because for me, whenever that's people's main concern about their kids and everything, that seems like that's more fear. You have a lot of fear, and the way that you look at God is very fearful. Um, and I get it. Some people will make that quote of like, what is it, like God fearing or whatever, but I personally have never understood that. I don't think you should fear God, honestly. Like, I think if God is all loving and all these things, I just don't know if that's like necessarily a healthy way to look at God. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah.
that may be a whole nother episode. That's a good one.
Think what you were saying, Mark, about like the intent and the motives and everything, I think that just, again, as someone who has stepped completely away from the church, I think, that is, I don't know, that is interesting. That's something that, I probably will reflect on, only because I think, and again, like that whole question, who is Jesus to you? I think it's also so easy. And it's just difficult because I think people in the church do kind of cloud that question, or they, complicate that question with the way that they behave and the way that they, you know, I guess practice their religion or their faith or whatever you want to say. So I think that that's also good to think about too, though, because yeah, there are, a lot of, and as someone who was deeply entrenched in the church, like, yes, I, never had bad intentions or anything like that, but it was kind of like when I was able to take a step back from, see it from a different point of view, it's kind of like nevertheless some of those things did cause harm to people. So I think I don't know, I just think that's very interesting, but that's also probably a whole other episode. But I think that that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think every one of these is a whole nother episode. Like, it just feeds into other issues that we're all trying to figure out. Okay. Like, I really will reflect more on this, and I always kind of wrestle with this, that children are so impressionable, and it is something we have to be very careful of, that we don't just guide them down a certain path. At the same time, I wonder what to do with what I think is a clear spiritual teaching in Christianity of having childlike faith, of there being this idea that Jesus talks to adults and tells them, you know what, you should become more like children. Instead of telling the children, you should really become like all these adults around you. Most of the time, if they were religious leaders, he had choice words for them, like, you've guided people astray, and that's a problem. Like with children, they led children astray, and that's very dangerous. But also, like, respecting children and acknowledging their curiosity, and it really is like a childlike faith, and there's something that's pure about it, there's something that's mysterious about it, and I think it's not just childish. I think there's something more to it, because I believe personally that there is a God. I believe that God is spiritual, and there's a spirit that interacts with us. And I don't think that children have a little junior sized Holy Spirit running around interacting with them. I think it's God. Like, God can interact with people in ways that, even as a child, developmentally, I don't think I got it. And then in some ways, I probably got it more than I do now, even. So it's just, it's mysterious, and I'm rambling a little bit, but that's what I'm left with, kind of wondering about.
No, I do agree with what Justine was saying about like the motives and the intent, because personally, I think, yeah, it is kind of easy sometimes when you leave a lot of that, like, not like that you start to generalize people in the church because of what you went through personally, but I think it's kind of like if you've met a lot of people in the church, or you've met too many people that have kind of, you've seen like bad intent with them, then it is much easier to be like, oh, like, okay, they have these characteristics, they have these things, like, okay, they're probably just like the other people in the church that I've dealt with, you know? So I do think that is, like Justine was saying, that is something to reflect on, and kind of like, it is an interesting perspective, I guess, and something to talk about, because yeah, I think it is easy to get wrapped up in, like I said, if you've had negative experiences in the church, then it's like hard to kind of see that there could be positive, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. I think the generalizing tendency is just something we all need to be aware of
Yeah.
all the time anyway. I think the easiest way to dismiss someone is to label them. And
Yeah.
so you just, like, you hear an argument, you hear something, you go, oh, well, that's because they're evangelical. Oh, that's because they're church. Or, oh, that's because they're
Mhm.
deconstructing. Like, you just label that person, and then you're just like able to like dismiss them and just move on.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think we're all guilty of that at times.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. For those of you listening or watching, very curious if you could provide us with some feedback and what your thoughts are on any of this that we've talked about today. This driving question: what is the best way to start teaching the Christian faith? What is the most foundational, fundamental? What should be step number one? What are your thoughts on that? We brought up things about children and raising children and their spiritual development, and the afterlife. That threat or promise of an afterlife came up. If you have any thoughts on that, I'm very curious to hear those things. You can subscribe on Substack to this podcast, and follow us on Instagram, and YouTube will have the video version of the podcast up as well. Thank you, Kaitlyn. Thank you, Justine. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks.